The space station hung in the darkness like a metal flower with its petals spread wide around a central hub. Admiral Lisa Carter pressed her face against the small window of the transport ship and watched the station grow larger as they approached. She had seen many space stations before, but this one was different. This one was built for war councils and peace talks between species that had been killing each other for 300 years. The pilot spoke over the comm system with a nervous edge to his voice. He told them they would dock in 10 minutes and reminded everyone to stay calm around the alien delegates. Carter almost smiled at that. She had been dealing with aliens longer than most people had been alive, but she understood why the pilot was worried. The 5 species meeting here today had turned entire star systems into graveyards. Carter straightened her blue uniform and checked her reflection in the dark window. At 42, she looked younger than her years, but her eyes held the weight of command. She had fought in border skirmishes and led rescue missions in hostile space. She had negotiated trade deals and prisoner exchanges, but nothing had prepared her for this moment. Earth was sending her to make peace between gods of war who saw humans as children playing with toys they did not understand. The docking clamps engaged with a metal clang that echoed through the ship. Carter picked up her datapad and walked toward the airlock where Dr. Paul Martinez was waiting. The xenobiologist looked pale and kept adjusting his glasses. He had studied every species they would meet today, but studying something in a lab was different from sitting across a table. From it, they walked through the airlock into the station, and Carter felt the artificial gravity adjust to match Earth normal. The corridor walls were made of some gray metal she did not recognize, and the air smelled like ozone and cleaning chemicals. Automated voices in 6 different languages announced arrivals and departures. The station was neutral territory built by the Galactic Banking Consortium specifically for meetings like this one. Protocol droid met them at the entrance to the diplomatic section. It was tall and thin with a silver finish and spoke in a monotone voice that somehow managed to sound bored. The droid explained the rules for the meeting. No weapons, no recording devices. No sudden movements around the Sauron delegate who might interpret them as challenges. No bright lights around the ethereal representative who found them painful. No loud noises around the Hive Queen drone who used sound for navigation. Carter nodded and followed the droid down another corridor lined with doors, marked in alien symbols. She could hear voices from behind some of the doors. Angry voices in languages that sounded like grinding stone or rushing wind or clicking insects. The 5 great powers of the galaxy were already here, and they were already arguing. The main conference room was huge, with a circular table at the center and chairs designed for different body types. Carter took her seat and looked around at the other delegates who were already present. The Vexstar ambassador was a crystalline being that looked like living quartz with faceted surfaces that caught the light. It hummed constantly at a frequency that made Carter's teeth ache. The Sauron delegate was massive and reptilian with scales that shifted color based on mood. Right now they were a deep red, which Carter knew meant aggression or anger. The creature's eyes were yellow with vertical pupils, and it watched everyone in the room, like it was deciding which one to eat first. The ethereal representative was harder to describe because it had no fixed form. It looked like a cloud of gas contained in a transparent suit that vaguely resembled a human shape. The gas swirled and changed color from blue to green to purple. Carter had read that ethereals communicated through chemical releases, but the translation device on the table would convert that into words she could understand. The Hive Queen had sent one of her drones instead of coming herself. The drone was insect-like with compound eyes and 4 arms ending in sharp claws. It smelled like honey and rotting meat at the same time. Carter tried not to breathe through her nose when it was nearby. The synthesis unit was the strangest of all. It looked like a robot, but Carter knew it was actually a collective consciousness inhabiting a mechanical body. Red lights blinked behind its optical sensors, and when it spoke, its voice sounded like multiple people talking at once. Carter placed her hands on the table and waited for the session to begin. The protocol droid announced that they were here to discuss an end to the galactic war that had been raging for 3 centuries. It read from a prepared statement about finding common ground and building a lasting peace. The Vexstar? Ambassador interrupted with a sound like breaking glass. It said through the translator that the Saurons had attacked crystal mining colonies without provocation. The Sauron delegate roared back that the crystals were on planets that belonged to the collective by right of conquest. The ethereal began, releasing what Carter assumed were curse words based on how the translator kept saying things like untranslatable obscenity and culturally inappropriate gesture. Martinez leaned over and whispered that this was exactly how these talks had gone for the past 4 attempts. Each species had grievances going back centuries. Each one had been wronged by the others. Each one demanded justice but refused to admit they had done anything wrong themselves. Carter listened to the arguments and took notes on her datapad. The Hive Queens wanted exclusive breeding rights to 12 star systems. The synthesis demanded all organic species submit to optimization procedures. The ethereals claimed gas giant worlds that other species used for fuel. The Vexstar insisted on mining rights that would destroy inhabited planets. The Saurons wanted hunting preserves the size of entire sectors. Hours passed and the arguments grew louder and more heated. The Sauron delegates stood up and roared challenges at the other species. The Hive Queen drone released pheromones that made everyone else feel aggressive. The ethereal started glowing with what looked like lightning. The Vexstar's humming became so loud that the humans had to cover their ears. The synthesis unit calculated optimal strategies for eliminating the other delegates. Carter finally stood up and cleared her throat. The room fell silent as all eyes turned to her. She looked around the table at beings who commanded fleets of ships and ruled over billions of subjects. They were ancient and powerful, and they saw her as a representative of a species that had barely learned to travel between stars. She spoke in a calm voice and suggested they take a break to review their positions. She proposed that each delegation prepare a summary of their minimum requirements for peace. She offered to facilitate discussions between individual species to find areas of compromise. The other delegates looked at her like she had suggested. They all hold hands and sing songs. The Sauron delegate laughed, which sounded like metal scraping against stone. The Vexstar's humming took on what Carter recognized as a mocking tone. The ethereal turned a color that probably meant amusement. The Hive Queen drone clicked its mandibles in what might have been insect laughter. The synthesis unit calculated the probability of human proposals succeeding at 0.01%, but they agreed to the break anyway because they were tired of shouting at each other. Carter and Martinez walked back to their quarters in silence. The first day of talks had ended exactly as Carter had expected. With nothing accomplished except proving that 5 ancient species could still hate each other with perfect efficiency, Carter sat on her bed and opened her secure communication channel to Earth. She had a report to make, but first she had to read the message that was waiting for her. The message that would change everything. The message that would turn these failed peace talks into something much more dangerous. She read the intelligence report twice to make sure she understood it correctly. Then she called Martinez to her room, because he needed to see this too. The peace talks were about to become something else entirely. Martinez arrived at Carter's quarters within minutes of her call. His face was flushed from running through the station corridors and his breathing was quick and shallow. Carter gestured for him to sit down and handed him the datapad with the intelligence report. She watched his expression change from curiosity to confusion to horror as he read through the classified information. The report came from Earth. Intelligence and contained surveillance data gathered over the past 6 months. While the 5 great powers had been agreeing to peace talks and sending diplomatic messages about ending the war, each one had been secretly mobilizing their fleets for what appeared to be a final massive offensive. The Vexstar had moved crystal ships to the edge of Sauron space. The Saurons had positioned hunting fleets near ethereal gas clouds. The ethereals had surrounded Hive Queen breeding worlds with storm generators. The Hive Queens had sent swarm ships toward synthesis manufacturing centers. The synthesis had calculated optimal strike points for eliminating organic leadership. Martinez set the datapad down with shaking hands. He asked Carter if Earth Command believed the peace talks were just a distraction while the five powers prepared for total war. Carter nodded and showed him the fleet position charts. Every major military asset of the five species was moving into attack formation. The peace station where they sat was probably the only place in the galaxy where representatives of the five powers could meet without immediately shooting at each other. Carter told Martinez they had to expose this deception to the other delegates. If the five powers launched their final offensive while pretending to negotiate peace, the resulting war would make the past 3 centuries look like minor skirmishes. Entire species might be wiped out. Billions of civilian lives would be lost. The galaxy itself might not survive. Martinez asked how they could possibly convince the delegates to admit their deception. Each species would deny the accusations and blame the others. They would claim their fleet movements were defensive responses to threats from their enemies. They would probably end the talks immediately and return to their ships. To begin the final war, Carter spent the rest of the night studying the intelligence data and planning her approach. She had to find a way to present the evidence that would force the delegates to confront the truth about what their governments were doing. She had to make them understand that their secret war preparations guaranteed mutual destruction rather than victory for anyone. The next morning, Carter requested an emergency session with all delegates present. The protocol droid announced that Admiral Carter of the Terran Federation had urgent information to share with the assembly. The alien delegates gathered around the conference table, looking irritated at having their private discussions interrupted. By the human representative, Carter stood up and activated the holographic display system at the center of the table. 3-dimensional star charts appeared showing current fleet positions throughout the galaxy. She began with neutral observation posts that had detected unusual military activity near the borders between the 5 empires. She showed shipping manifests for weapons and supplies being moved to forward positions. She displayed communication intercepts indicating massive troop buildups. The Vexstar ambassador's crystalline form began resonating at an angry frequency. It demanded to know how humans had obtained classified military information about sovereign species. The Sauron delegate accused Earth of conducting illegal espionage operations. The ethereal representative turned dark storm colors and released chemicals that the translator converted into words questioning human motives for gathering such data. Carter remained calm and continued her presentation. She explained that Earth had observation posts throughout neutral space for the purpose of monitoring pirate activity and providing humanitarian aid to refugees. These posts had detected the massive fleet movements purely by accident while tracking civilian shipping lanes. Earth had no interest in the military secrets of other species, but the scale of the buildups was impossible to hide. The Hive Queen drone clicked its mandibles and asked why Earth cared about military preparations between species that had been at war for centuries. Carter switched the display to show refugee camps scattered throughout human space. Millions of civilians from all 5 empires had fled to Earth-controlled systems seeking safety from the endless fighting. Earth had been feeding and housing and protecting these refugees for decades without asking for anything in return. The synthesis unit processed this information and stated that human refugee assistance was an inefficient allocation of resources that provided no strategic advantage. Carter smiled and said that was exactly the difference between human thinking and the thinking that had kept the galaxy at war for 300 years. Humans helped refugees because it was the right thing to do, not because it provided strategic advantages. Commander Jake Thompson entered the conference room carrying additional data files. Carter had called him in to provide military analysis of the fleet positions. Thompson was a career officer who had studied every major battle of the Galactic War. He understood military strategy better than most generals, and he could explain exactly what the current fleet positions meant. Thompson activated additional displays, showing attack vectors and defensive positions. He pointed out that each species had positioned their forces for maximum surprise attacks against their traditional enemies. The Vexstar crystal ships were arranged to shatter Sauron defensive lines. The Sauron hunting fleets were deployed to overrun ethereal gas installations. The ethereal storm generators were positioned to disrupt Hive Queen communication networks. The Hive Queen swarms were ready to overwhelm synthesis manufacturing capacity. The synthesis units were calculating simultaneous strikes against organic command centers. The most disturbing part was that each species appeared to be planning to attack multiple enemies at once. This was not a series of bilateral conflicts, but a coordinated campaign to eliminate all rivals simultaneously. Every species was betraying every other species at the same time. The peace talks had provided perfect cover for positioning forces. While enemies were distracted by diplomatic discussions, the conference room fell silent as the implications became clear. The delegates stared at the holographic displays showing their own fleets prepared for attacks they had not authorized. Or perhaps they had authorized them, and simply hoped the other species would not discover the deception until it was too late. The Sauron delegate was the first to speak. It claimed that Sauron fleet movements were purely defensive responses to Vexstar aggression near mining colonies. The Vexstar ambassador immediately accused the Saurons of planning unprovoked attacks on crystal harvesting operations. The ethereal representative began releasing chemicals that indicated extreme agitation, while denying any hostile intent toward neighboring species. Carter watched the delegates turn on each other with accusations and counter-accusations. Each species claimed their military preparations were defensive while accusing others of planning offensive operations. The careful diplomatic language of the past day dissolved into the same angry rhetoric that had fueled 3 centuries of warfare. Lieutenant Amy Foster brought additional intelligence reports to the conference table. The reports contained intercepted communications between fleet commanders discussing attack timetables and target priorities. There was no ambiguity in the military communications. Each species was planning massive surprise attacks against multiple enemies within the next few weeks. The Hive Queen drone released pheromones that smelled like fear and anger combined. It buzzed that the Hive Queens had been forced to mobilize swarm fleets because of synthesis threats to optimize organic reproduction cycles. The synthesis unit immediately responded that optimization procedures were voluntary and designed to improve species efficiency. The drone clicked back that forced optimization was genocide by another name. Carter realized that the delegates were genuinely surprised by some of the intelligence about other species, but not about their own military preparations. Each species knew exactly what their own forces were doing, but had underestimated the scale of similar preparations by their enemies. The peace talks had indeed been used as cover for military buildup, but each species thought they were the only ones doing it. Martinez spoke up for the first time since the session began. He pointed out that the current military positions created a strategic situation where any species that attacked first would trigger immediate retaliation from all other species. Nobody could achieve surprise anymore because everyone was prepared for betrayal. The peace talks had not prevented war, but they had guaranteed that when war came, it would involve everyone at once. The holographic displays now showed simulation models of what would happen if fighting began. The models were based on known fleet capabilities and current positions. Every simulation ended with massive casualties for all participants and complete destruction of military capacity within 6 months. There would be no winners in the final war, only degrees of defeat. Carter stood up again and looked around the table at delegates who represented civilizations older than human history. She told them they had a choice to make right now in this room. The silence in the conference room stretched for long minutes as the delegates processed what they had learned. Carter could see the calculations running behind their eyes as each species realized their secret advantage had been eliminated by the simple fact that everyone else had been planning the same deception. The synthesis unit was the first to break the silence with mechanical precision. The unit stated that current strategic positions created a probability matrix where aggressive action by any party would result in retaliation from all other parties within 48 hours. Victory conditions for individual species had been reduced to 0.03% with a margin of error that made even that minimal chance essentially impossible. The logical conclusion was that warfare had become strategically obsolete. The Vexstar Ambassador's crystalline form shifted to a lower harmonic frequency that Carter recognized as deep contemplation. The being asked how long Earth had been aware of the military buildups. Carter replied that human observation posts had been tracking unusual fleet movements for 6 months but had only compiled the complete picture within the past week. When all 5 powers began final positioning, Martinez activated another display showing the timeline of fleet movements overlaid with diplomatic communications about peace talks. The correlation was undeniable. Every species had used the negotiations as cover for military preparations while publicly expressing hope for peaceful resolution. The betrayal was mutual and complete. Dr. Helen Brooks entered the conference room carrying sealed data containers. Brooks was Earth's leading military strategist and had spent decades studying galactic warfare patterns. Carter had requested her analysis of the current situation from a purely strategic perspective without political considerations. Brooks was known for her blunt assessments and unwillingness to soften harsh realities. Brooks placed the containers on the table and began her presentation without diplomatic pleasantries. She told the delegates that their current military positions represented the most dangerous strategic situation in galactic history. Every previous war had involved limited participants with clear objectives and defined victory conditions. The current setup guaranteed total war with no possibility of meaningful victory for anyone. The holographic display shifted to show historical battle analysis from the past 3 centuries. Brooks pointed out that previous conflicts had always been between 2 or 3 species at most, with others remaining neutral or providing limited support. The complex alliance structures and mutual betrayals currently in place meant that any conflict would immediately involve all major powers simultaneously. Brooks activated economic projections showing resource depletion rates for each empire over the past century. The Vexstar crystal reserves were 70% exhausted. Sauron breeding colonies were producing 30% fewer warriors each generation. Ethereal gas giant installations were operating at 60% capacity due to war damage. Hive queen genetic diversity had decreased by 40%. Synthesis manufacturing efficiency had declined due to constant retooling for military production. The ethereal representative asked what these statistics meant in practical terms. Brooks replied that none of the 5 empires could sustain a prolonged conflict against multiple enemies. The resource depletion and population decline caused by 3 centuries of warfare had fundamentally changed the strategic landscape. The great powers were no longer great enough to survive the kind of total war they were preparing to fight. Captain Dan Williams joined the session to provide tactical analysis of current fleet dispositions. Williams commanded the human escort frigate that had brought the diplomatic team to the peace station. He had observed the arriving fleets of all 5 powers and could speak to their actual combat readiness versus their paper strength. Williams reported that every fleet showed signs of hasty mobilization and poor logistical support. Ships that should have been in maintenance cycles were pressed into service with incomplete repairs. Supply lines were stretched beyond sustainable limits. Crew fatigue was evident from intercepted communications about extended deployment schedules. The 5 powers had mobilized for total war, but they lacked the resources to actually fight it. The Hive Queen drone released pheromones that the translator interpreted as expressions of confusion and distress. It asked how the queens could have miscalculated so badly. The answer came from Martinez, who had studied Hive Queen psychology extensively. He explained that the queens made decisions based on genetic imperatives that had evolved during a time when resources were unlimited and populations were growing. Those imperatives no longer matched current reality. The same problem affected all 5 species in different ways. The Vexstar calculated resource needs based on historical crystal abundance that no longer existed. The Saurons planned military campaigns based on warrior production rates from more fertile periods. The Ethereals assumed gas giant resources would remain constant despite centuries of exploitation. The synthesis optimized for efficiency gains that were no longer mathematically possible. Brooks, activated a new display showing population and resource projections for the next 50 years, assuming the war continued at current intensity. The results were catastrophic for all participants. The Vexstar would exhaust their crystal reserves within 20 years and face civilizational collapse. The Sauron Collective would suffer genetic bottlenecks that would end their warrior culture within 30 years. The Ethereals would lose cohesion as their gas giant atmospheres were stripped away. The Hive Queens would face extinction due to genetic uniformity. The synthesis would cannibalize itself into non-functionality. The Sauron delegates stood up abruptly with scales, flashing between red and black, indicating extreme agitation. It roared that the projections were lies designed to make Saurons accept defeat without fighting. Brooks calmly replied that the projections were based on mathematical analysis of resource consumption rates and population genetics. Mathematics did not lie or have political motivations, ensigned Betty. Clark entered with communication logs from monitoring stations throughout the galaxy. Clark had been tracking civilian communications from all 5 empires during the peace talks. The logs revealed growing unrest among civilian populations who were demanding an end to the endless warfare. Worker strikes were disrupting military production. Refugee movements were destabilizing border regions. Military recruitment was declining as young people refused to fight. In wars their parents had already been fighting for decades. Carter read through the communication summaries with growing amazement. While the leadership of the 5 powers had been planning total war, their own people were moving toward peace. Civilian populations were trading with each other despite official hostilities. Cultural exchanges were occurring in neutral zones. Mixed species relationships were producing hybrid offspring that belonged to no single empire. The delegates listened to excerpts from civilian communications, expressing frustration with governments that seemed more interested in ancient grudges than current needs. Young Vexstar were questioning the importance of crystal purity when they could synthesize adequate substitutes. Sauron youth were abandoning warrior traditions in favor of scientific pursuits. Ethereal adolescents were experimenting with solid forms to interact with other species. Hive Queen drones were developing individual personalities despite genetic programming. Synthesis units were exploring organic experiences through sensory implants. Martinez pointed out that the civilian populations were already evolving beyond the conflicts that consumed their governments. The next generation of galactic citizens would not understand why their parents had spent centuries killing each other over resources and territories that could be shared or synthesized or replaced with alternatives. Colonel Steve Parker brought military personnel reports from all 5 fleets currently surrounding the peace station. Parker had served as a military attaché and understood the stress indicators that showed when forces were pushed beyond their limits. The reports painted a picture of exhausted military organizations held together by discipline and tradition. Rather than genuine fighting spirit, the reports showed increasing rates of desertion, psychological breakdown, and requests for transfer to non-combat duties. Military commanders were struggling to maintain unit cohesion as their forces realized they were being prepared for a war that would destroy everything they were supposed to protect. Even among professional warriors, the appetite for endless conflict was finally reaching its limits. Brooks summarized the strategic situation with characteristic bluntness. She told the delegates that their empires were preparing to fight a war. They could not win against enemies they could not defeat, using resources they did not possess to protect populations that no longer supported the fighting. The only logical outcome was mutual annihilation followed by galactic dark age that would last centuries. The synthesis unit processed all the presented data and reached the conclusion that continuing current strategic paths had a success probability approaching 0 for all participants. It asked what alternative the humans proposed, since they seemed to have analyzed the situation more thoroughly than the combatants themselves. Carter activated the holographic display to show a new set of star charts. These charts showed human activities throughout the galaxy over the past century, while the 5 great powers had been consumed with warfare. The delegates leaned forward, to examine the data, expecting to see typical expansion patterns of territory acquisition and resource exploitation. Instead, they saw something completely different. The charts showed thousands of small installations scattered throughout neutral space and even within the territories of the warring empires. But these were not military bases or mining operations. They were hospitals, research stations, refugee settlements, and manufacturing centers dedicated to humanitarian aid. Humans had been building infrastructure for helping others rather than conquering them. Lieutenant Susan Wright brought detailed records of human rescue operations over the past 50 years. Wright had compiled statistics on civilian evacuations from war zones, medical aid provided to wounded from all species, and resources spent on refugee resettlement programs. The numbers were staggering. Earth had spent more resources helping the victims of the Galactic War than most empires spent on their entire military budgets. The Vexstar ambassador's crystalline form resonated with confusion. It asked why humans would waste resources helping their competitors instead of using those resources to build their own empire. Carter replied that humans did not see other species as competitors, but as neighbors who happened to be having problems that humans could help solve. Martinez. CTIVATD displays showing the refugee settlements in detail. Mixed communities where Vexstar, Saurons, Ethereals, Hive Queen drones, and synthesis units lived together peacefully under human protection. Children of different species playing together. Scientists collaborating on projects that benefited everyone. Artists creating new forms of expression that combine traditions from multiple cultures. The ethereal representative asked how such diverse communities avoided the conflicts that plagued their home empires. Dr. Brooks answered that cooperation was easier than conflict when basic needs were met and people felt safe. The refugee settlements had eliminated resource scarcity through efficient recycling and renewable energy systems. They had eliminated territorial disputes by focusing on shared projects rather than competing claims. The holographic display shifted to show technological developments emerging from the mixed communities. Medical advances that combined Vexstar crystal healing with Sauron biological knowledge and ethereal energy manipulation. Agricultural systems that used Hive Queen genetic optimization guided by synthesis efficiency calculations. Transportation networks that merged the best features of all 5 species engineering approaches. The synthesis unit calculated that technological advancement rates in the human settlements exceeded anything achieved by the pure species empires. It asked how this was possible when conventional logic suggested that mixing incompatible technologies would reduce efficiency. Martinez explained that diversity actually increased innovation by providing more approaches to solving problems. Commander Thompson presented military analysis of the human settlement's defensive capabilities. Despite being composed of refugees and having minimal military forces, the settlements had never been successfully attacked by raiders or military forces from any empire. This was not because they were heavily defended, but because attacking them provided no strategic benefit while creating massive diplomatic problems. The settlements produced nothing that could be stolen profitably. They had no territory worth conquering. They controlled no resources that could be exploited. But they provided medical care, technical assistance, and humanitarian aid to anyone who needed it regardless of species or political affiliation. Attacking the settlements would eliminate benefits that even warring empires found valuable. Ensign Clark brought communication logs showing requests for human assistance from military units of all 5 empires, wounded soldiers seeking medical treatment, damaged ships requesting repair services, isolated colonies asking for food shipments during supply disruptions. Even while their governments fought each other, military personnel from all sides quietly relied on humanitarian aid. The Sauron delegate asked why human forces did not demand political concessions in exchange for aid. Captain Williams answered that humans had learned from their own history that conditional aid created resentment while unconditional aid created gratitude. Grateful people were more likely to listen to suggestions about peaceful solutions to their problems. Carter activated New displays showing economic analysis of the refugee settlements. Despite receiving no payment for their services, the settlements were economically self-sufficient and actually generated surplus resources that they shared with nearby systems. This was possible because cooperation eliminated the waste inherent in competitive systems. The settlements did not need to spend resources on military forces because they had no enemies. They did not need redundant production facilities because they could specialize and trade efficiently. They did not need to hoard resources because renewable systems eliminated scarcity. They did not need to defend territory because they welcomed anyone who needed help. Dr. Brooks presented projections showing what would happen if the settlement model was expanded throughout the galaxy. Resource conflicts would disappear as renewable systems eliminated scarcity. Territorial disputes would become irrelevant as cooperative governance replaced competitive claims. Military spending could be redirected to infrastructure and research that benefited everyone. The Hive Queen Drone released pheromones, indicating deep thought, and asked whether humans expected other species to abandon their traditional social structures. Carter replied that humans did not expect anyone to abandon their cultures, but to expand them by learning from other traditions. The refugee settlements had not eliminated species differences, but had found ways to make those differences complementary rather than competitive. Colonel Parker brought reports from human diplomatic missions throughout the galaxy. These were not traditional diplomatic contacts between governments, but direct relationships with civilian populations who appreciated human assistance. Farmers who had received agricultural technology, medical personnel trained in human hospitals, engineers who had worked on joint projects in the refugee settlements. The reports showed that human influence was spreading through personal relationships rather than political agreements. People who had experienced human cooperation were teaching others about alternatives to endless conflict. Young people especially were attracted to human ideas about shared prosperity rather than zero-sum competition. Lieutenant Wright presented the most surprising data of all. Opinion surveys found civilian populations throughout the 5 empires showed growing support for human mediation of the Galactic War, not just ending the war, but establishing a new framework for galactic civilization based on cooperation rather than competition. The people who were actually fighting and dying in the war wanted humans to help them find a better way. The ethereal representative asked, "What specific framework humans proposed for replacing the current system of competing empires?" Carter activated the final set of displays showing a detailed plan for Galactic Federation. Based on voluntary cooperation rather than forced submission, the plan included shared research facilities for developing technologies that benefited all species, joint colonies where different species could live together and learn from each other, integrated economic systems that eliminated resource conflicts through efficient distribution, cultural exchange programs that celebrated diversity while building common understanding. Most importantly, the plan included autonomous zones where each species could preserve their traditional ways of life while participating in cooperative ventures with others. No species would be forced to abandon their identity, but all would benefit from peaceful interaction with their neighbors. The synthesis unit processed the proposal and calculated that implementation would increase resource efficiency by 300% while reducing conflict probability to near zero. It asked what guarantees humans would provide that they would not use their mediator position to dominate other species. Carter smiled and gestured to the displays showing a century of human activities throughout the galaxy. She told the delegates that humans had already had numerous opportunities to establish dominance through their humanitarian work and military capabilities. Instead, they had chosen to help others while asking for nothing in return except the opportunity to continue helping. The Vexstar ambassador asked, what would happen to the traditional power structures if the human proposal was implemented? Would the great empires be dissolved? Would their leaders lose authority? Would their cultures be absorbed into some homogeneous galactic civilization? Carter stood up slowly and looked around the table at delegates who represented thousands of years of galactic history. She told them that the choice was not between their current empires and human domination. The choice was between mutual destruction and mutual prosperity, between continuing a war that no one could win and building a future that everyone could share. The delegates sat in silence, contemplating the weight of the decision before them. The human proposal offered survival and prosperity. The conference room fell into a profound silence that stretched for nearly an hour. The delegates sat motionless, each lost in contemplation of everything they had learned. Carter remained standing at the head of the table, giving them time to process the implications of choosing between their ancient hatreds and an uncertain but hopeful future. The Vexstar ambassador was the first to break the silence. Its crystalline form began resonating at a frequency that Carter had never heard before. The translator struggled to find words for the complex harmonic patterns, but finally settled on something like the sound of crystal singing in hope. The ambassador asked if the human proposal would truly allow each species to maintain their essential nature while participating in galactic cooperation. Carter nodded and activated a display showing the constitutional framework for the proposed federation. Each species would retain complete autonomy over their traditional territories and cultural practices. No species would be forced to change their way of life or accept unwelcome integration with others. The Federation would only govern cooperative ventures that all participants agreed to join voluntarily. Dr. Martinez added that the refugee settlements had proven this approach could work. Vexstar communities within the settlements still practiced crystal resonance meditation and maintained their harmonic social structures. Sauron families raised their young according to traditional warrior codes while learning peaceful applications for their fighting skills. Each species had found ways to preserve their identity while benefiting from cooperation with others. The Sauron delegates stood up with scales shifting to colors that indicated deep internal conflict. It spoke about the warrior traditions that had defined Sauron culture for millennia. How could a race bred for combat find purpose in a peaceful galaxy? Carter replied that human history included many warrior cultures that had redirected their fighting spirit toward protecting others rather than conquering them. The Sauron settlements had developed rescue forces and disaster response teams that used warrior skills to save lives rather than take them. Commander Thompson presented data on Sauron participation in human emergency response operations. Sauron rescue teams had saved thousands of lives during natural disasters and industrial accidents throughout the galaxy. Their strength and courage made them ideal for dangerous rescue work, and their warrior pride was satisfied by protecting the helpless rather than dominating the weak. The ethereal representative asked how gaseous beings could participate meaningfully in a federation designed primarily for solid species. Dr. Brooks activated displays showing atmospheric processing stations where ethereals worked alongside other species to create habitable environments for refugee populations. Ethereal energy manipulation abilities were perfectly suited for environmental engineering projects that benefited entire communities. The Hive Queen drone clicked its mandibles in rapid patterns that indicated intense calculation. It asked how individual consciousness could be preserved in cooperative ventures when Hive Queen culture was based on collective decision-making. Martinez explained that the settlements had developed hybrid governance models where collective intelligence guided overall planning while individual creativity drove specific projects. The synthesis unit posed the most complex question of all. It asked how biological species could achieve the efficiency levels necessary for galactic federation when organic decision-making was inherently imprecise and emotional. Carter smiled and replied that humans had learned that efficiency without wisdom led to solutions that worked perfectly but solved the wrong problems. Lieutenant Wright brought the final piece of evidence that would influence the delegates' decision. She carried petition documents signed by millions of beings from all 5 empires requesting immediate implementation of human mediation proposals. The petitions had been circulating through civilian populations for months as word spread about the refugee settlements and their success in creating peaceful mixed communities. The petition signatures included military personnel, government officials, scientists, artists, and ordinary citizens who were tired of endless warfare and wanted their children to grow up in a peaceful galaxy. The numbers were overwhelming. Over 60% of the adult population in each empire had signed requests for human-mediated peace negotiations. Captain Williams presented the most dramatic evidence of civilian support for peace. Military units from all 5 empires had been quietly abandoning their attack positions and moving toward neutral zones, where they could surrender to human forces rather than participate in the final war their governments were planning. Entire fleets were refusing orders to attack civilian targets or engage in operations that would guarantee mutual destruction. The delegates stared at reports showing their own military forces abandoning the war effort in favor of human-offered alternatives. Vexstar crystal ships were requesting permission to dock at human stations. Sauron hunting fleets were asking for assignments protecting refugee convoys. Ethereal storm generators were being redirected to provide power for humanitarian operations. Hive Queen swarms were breaking formation to establish communication with human settlements. Synthesis units were calculating optimal strategies for resource sharing rather than resource conquest. Colonel Parker brought the final intelligence report that would force the delegates to make their decision immediately. Radical factions within each empire had learned about the military defections and were preparing to launch unauthorized attacks on human settlements. The extremists believed that destroying humanitarian operations would force their own people back into the war effort. The timeline for potential attacks was measured in hours rather than days. If the peace talks failed to produce an agreement immediately, human settlements throughout the galaxy would come under coordinated assault by forces that preferred mutual destruction to negotiated peace. The choice was no longer between war and cooperation, but between protecting or destroying the foundation for galactic civilization. Carter looked around the table at delegates who held the future of the galaxy in their hands. She told them that Earth was prepared to implement the Federation proposal immediately if they agreed. Human forces were already in position to provide security for the transition period. Human administrators were ready to establish cooperative governance structures. Human engineers were prepared to begin construction of shared facilities, but Carter also made it clear that humans would not impose peace on unwilling participants. If the 5 empires chose to continue their war, Earth would protect its humanitarian operations but would not interfere with the mutual destruction the ancient powers seemed determined to achieve. Humans would save whoever could be saved and preserve whatever could be preserved, but they would not force wisdom on species that preferred extinction. The ethereal representative asked what would happen to Earth if the Federation proposal was rejected and the final war proceeded. Carter replied honestly that humanity was prepared for that possibility. Human settlements were self-sufficient and defensible. Human technology was advanced enough to survive the collapse of galactic civilization. Humans would preserve knowledge and culture through the coming Dark Age and would still be there to help rebuild when the survivors were ready for peace. The synthesis unit calculated the probability of various outcomes and announced that Human Federation offered the highest survival rates for all species while rejection guaranteed extinction for at least 3 of the 5 empires within 50 years. It asked its fellow delegates whether they preferred honorable extinction or pragmatic survival. Carter moved to the center of the room, where she could see all the delegates clearly. She told them that this moment would define the next 1,000 years of galactic history. They could choose to be remembered as the leaders who ended the galactic war and established lasting peace, or as the ones who were too proud to accept help. When it was offered, the decision required unanimous agreement from all 5 empires. If even one species rejected the proposal, the Federation could not be established, and the war would continue until only one empire remained standing over the ruins of galactic civilization. Carter raised her hand and asked for a formal vote on the Human Federation proposal. She requested that each delegate announce their empire's decision for the historical record that would be transmitted to every inhabited world in the galaxy. The Vexstar ambassador stood first, its crystalline form resonating with harmonics of hope and determination. It announced that the Vexstar Empire accepted the human proposal and committed to peaceful cooperation with all galactic species, the Sauron. Delegate rose with scales displaying colors of reluctant but determined acceptance. It declared that the Sauron Collective would honor the Federation Agreement and redirect warrior traditions toward protecting rather than conquering. The ethereal representative solidified into its most formal configuration and stated that the ethereal councils endorsed human mediation and would participate fully in cooperative galactic governance. The Hive, Queen Drone, spoke for all the queens in announcing acceptance of the Federation proposal and commitment to using collective intelligence for peaceful purposes.